I was never very good at history at school. We didn't have very good history teachers. I recall one who used to sit there reading from the textbook, and it was deadly dull. But the one area of history that did fascinate me was the history of science. And indeed I recall an examination where I managed to scrape 50%, 20 marks of which came from the essay on history of science, 20 out of 20, and scraping marks in the other 4 subjects to make up the 50%. So history of science, history of medicine always fascinated me, and it was part of my interest in medicine as a whole. And I think it's actually important for doctors to be interested in the history of their subject, because it teaches you many things that you don't learn from other aspects of medicine, either from the textbooks or even in clinical practice. So when I came to write my thesis on the clinical pharmacology of the cardiac glycosides, specifically digoxin, I thought that I ought to write a chapter on the history of the subject. Now, if you're writing a thesis on genomics, there isn't a lot of history to cover, even if you go back as far as Gregor Mendel, let's say, but the modern history of genomics is rather short, relatively short. The history of cardiac glycosides goes back hundreds of years. And so I found myself researching the history in some depth. The major feature of that history is a monograph that was published in 1785 by a Birmingham physician called William Withering, who is famous as the first physician to have used foxgloves, which is where the cardiac glycosides come from, or some cardiac glycosides come from, in the treatment of what he called dropsies, namely abnormal collections of fluid in the body. And his text is actually very perceptive. He studied about 160 cases of dropsies and showed the types of dropsies in which the foxglove was beneficial and the types of dropsies in which it wasn't. And he was able to show, for example, that heart disease causing dropsy responded to foxglove, whereas ovarian disease, for example, and other forms of collections of fluid in the body did not. So I decided I would have to study the history of this subject in some depth. And of course it goes back before Withering, but his was the main topic. And so late 18th century pharmacology and therapeutics became a topic of interest to me. And in fact I made some original discoveries in the field. I can't say I really appreciated that at the time, to be honest. I was very fortunate to meet Charles Webster, who at that time was the welcome reader in the history of medicine in the University of Oxford, and is now a Fellow of All Souls College and well known for his history of the National Health Service. I met Charles because I was a graduate student at Corpus Christi College, where he was the librarian fellow. And so I sought his advice about researching and writing this history of cardiac glycosides that I was interested in doing. And he asked me to send him the material I'd produced so far. And when he read it, he said he thought it was very good and that I ought to write it up as a piece of research. Well, I was very reluctant to do that because I didn't think that I was qualified as a medical historian, and that it would be arrogant of me to, or presumptuous of me to, try to enter into a field that was not my own, and in which I considered myself to be pretty much amateur. So I didn't do that, but I wrote it up as a chapter in my thesis.